Hello, everyone, and welcome to Buzz Corner. Tonight, we're going to have an exciting topic. This is Andrea. This is my sign name, and nice to see you tonight.
Hi, everybody. This is Bucky. Glad to be here.
Perfect. So we have a guest speaker for tonight. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Jonathan Silva. I'm excited to be a part of this discussion at Buzz Corner.
Awesome. Perfect. So the topic tonight is going to be the relationship between interpreters and interpreting agencies. What does that relationship look like? We're going to delve into that, and Jonathan is going to talk about that tonight. Now, I'm wondering if you can expand on your experience with interpreting agencies and that field itself. What have you seen?
Absolutely. I've been interpreting for 15 years now. And I started my career with an agency, and I interpreted with that agency for 8 years. Then I left that and went on my own path, as it were, and interpreted in a number of settings and environments. And looking back, I realized there's a lot to be said about the relationship with the agency. It's interesting. At the moment, what I'm seeing in the field is a lot of discussion about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how to negotiate, the whole issue of rates and terms, and the business of a 2-hour minimum. All of these things have been coming up, and it seems as though there isn't enough open discussion regarding all of this. So that's why I took this opportunity to be here at the Buzz Corner to talk about that, and I'm excited to do so this evening. One thing that I feel is a pretty significant
recording in progress
is that as we recognize who we are as interpreters, we're independent contractors, which means we're running a business. If we're running a business, that means we have to follow our own rules, our own rates, our own system, as a business. And agencies tend to have their own rate schedules. If they reach out, regardless of whether they reach out to the interpreter or the interpreter to the agency, in that negotiation with the agency and the agreement on the contract, when they offer a rate sheet to the interpreter, that means the interpreting in the agency is choosing the rates. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. And look at another example. If I wanted to order a table, to have it made, and that person who was making the table for me said to me how much they would offer to me the table at a certain price. I can negotiate that. I can talk to them about maybe lowering the price a little. But can you imagine if I said, I want these things, this is what I want, and the idea is it's a table, and then they sent me a price, and I said, no, I have a rate sheet. Here's what we pay for a table. Can you imagine if I told them we pay this amount? I wonder if that business would work. Am I right or am I wrong?
Obviously not. No, definitely. So you talk about a rate sheet, and so how would you see something like that, a pay schedule working? Because sometimes there's a reason behind that. Sometimes as an agency, we have to make sure that we're able to maintain our operations and our business costs. So how can we as an agency be more mindful about maintaining our business cost and those needs, but also meeting the needs of the interpreters?
Well, that question is very important. And the point is, you do have to run a business, and you have to have a profit margin. That's obvious. You're a business for profit. But I think in terms of the approach for an agency to say, this is my rate sheet, I'll pay you this, that, and the other, they can't really do that. Negotiation's fine, but the agency has to be more in tune with the area and how much the average rate is in that area. For example, a certified interpreter versus an uncertified interpreter, a specialized interpreter like a legal interpreter with the SCL or whatever. The agency has to know what's the median rate or regular rate for those different levels. And if a new interpreter comes in and says their rate is a certain amount and it's way over what the agency is accustomed to, the agency can tell them, well, we can't afford that. And it's the interpreter's responsibility to bring it down, and they have control over that. And clearly, if the agency can't afford that amount, because it doesn't make sense, because if they accept that amount, what they'd be paid would not provide them with any margin of profit or whatever, well, then the interpreter can drop the rate or not sign up for work, right? The agency doesn't have to hire that interpreter. So the onus is on the interpreter for the negotiation down. But if the agency tells them we pay this much for that much, they can't do that. I think that's a big problem in our field in general. There isn't enough discussion about rates and about how to negotiate with agencies. I think there's a question that's a huge piece of this discussion that most people overlook. And that point is, or that question is, do you know that the agencies need us? Individual contractors are required for the agency. The agency would fall apart without all those independent contractors. So the interpreters need to be wise that our services keep the agency's business going. And that means it's okay to negotiate. However, for them to tell us how much they'll pay us, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. That's inappropriate.
So I'd like to talk some more about, if we get a new interpreter that comes in, they just graduated from an ITP and they're coming in and they're expecting a rate that's equivalent to somebody who's been doing this for 30 years, and that they may be charging the same price. And if an agency accepts that cost, then what are we creating? If the interpreter with 30 years of experience feels like they're not getting that, they're obviously going to have a level of skill that a new interpreter is not going to have. And some 30-year interpreters may not have the same potential and knowledge as newer interpreters, but there's a balance there that we have to recognize. And so how can an agency honor the skill and experience of our veteran interpreters compared with our newer and novice interpreters?
That is a big problem that you've mentioned right there, right now. That's up. There are two different views, two different viewpoints, perhaps. Whether a person's new, young, recently graduated, not so skilled, or certified, regardless of their level of skill, they should be paid a certain amount of money or more. There's a minimum that they should be paid. And the reason for that is because if they charge a much lower rate or a lower rate at all, agencies are going to think about their bottom line. And they're going to get a bigger profit off of a lower paid interpreter. Whereas a person who's highly skilled, certified, 30 years experience and so forth, is a more expensive individual. So agencies might choose between those for the wrong reasons. They'll choose the less skilled interpreter for the greater profit margin, and less choose the more skilled interpreter for the lower profit margin. And then other people say, however, we don't really want everyone to be paid the same amount, because you're right, interpreters who've been working for 30 years, who are thoroughly experienced and familiar with the deaf community, and who are well versed with the whole work system and the community and so forth, they shouldn't be paid the same amount as some neophyte who's just come into the field. So that goes back to the agency and how they run their business. They have to look at, are they looking at their profit line only, or how they provide services? Let me go back to my example of the table. If a person created that table, a master craftsman, let's say, they don't have to be a master. The person who's buying the table doesn't have to be a master of craftsmanship around tables to know whether it's a good quality table. That the customer can look at that, or the person who's buying the table, and assess the quality. And if they can't, they can call somebody else to come in and assess the quality of that table. And then your money's paying the proper amount for what they're charging, that it's going to get the quality you're paying for. But the same thing is true if you think about interpreting. Interpreters provide a service, but once we've provided that service, it disappears. There's no way someone can come and look at the quality of that service once it's over with. Of course, we can assess the effect that that service had, meaning if the service was effective, the request was acceptable, maybe the appointment was successful or something like that. But we can't actually assess the quality of the service, and the consumer almost never knows what they're buying. Almost never. It's a little bit of the opposite case in our field. People who are buying services or products, they know what they're buying. But companies and businesses don't know what they're buying. They just know ADA says, there's a law that says we have to have an interpreter, so they buy the service and they contact an agency. And the agency has all the power, which means if the agency is willing to send an interpreter who is below par, who is not qualified, who is not a good fit or whatever, because of the larger profit margin, that's the agency's decision. And that's why we're seeing this phenomenon right now of all these young new interpreters charging so much, because the interpreters are hearing that the older, more experienced interpreters are complaining about the fact that they're hiring those other interpreters. So they're saying, I shouldn't say older interpreters, but more experienced interpreters are yelling at them. They're saying to them, stop taking all our work with your low rates. But it's because their rates are lower that they're in demand.
And I also feel that the agency sometimes doesn't know the difference. And it's not they can't, but they don't defend their jobs or their businesses, right? And so they just may go ahead and throw in a new interpreter that's new in the field and they contract with them. But you have to think about the independent contractors as well. They may not fully understand that the agency is benefiting from that. And they're getting additional profit because, like you said, it is a business mindset. At the same time, we have to think about what you mentioned before. If a person is not skilled and you're pulling in a second team who is, and you're basing a rate based on the one person's opinion of their skill, how does that affect the bottom line? And then what's the range that each interpreter could be paid? If there's no measurement and just one person says, well, you're good enough or you're not good enough, then that interpreter probably will not benefit from that work by taking that work. So I don't believe there's one right or wrong answer in this situation. I believe it does depend on where the services are provided, the quality of service. Like you said, a lot of new interpreters are coming into the field, but do they have the equivalent years of experience? So then can they really decide their rate? It's very, very important for us to think about all the nuances before deciding that.
Yes, the rate sheet is all right to have internally. The agency has to have something to compare rates in the area, of course. But to give that rate sheet to the interpreter and say, no, we only are willing to pay you what's on our rate sheet based on some arbitrary reason that they don't even know about, the interpreter doesn't even know about, that is a big problem. But the agency does have to have an internal tool, of course. I completely agree with that. For example, I run a little tiny agency, and I have over the years, I've had a number of people who've come to me and given me their rate, and I was ready to have a heart attack because it was so much. I wish I made that much money myself. And I'm not sure where they came up with that number. I don't blame them. We don't talk about it enough. We don't have an open discussion in the field. They don't know the going rate. We don't know the going rate. Everybody keeps it confidential. We don't talk about each other's pay and how much we make. We don't tend to do that. And that will cause this huge variation in rates. And sometimes agencies take great advantage of that variation. I've met a number of interpreters who are fabulous interpreters, but they charge less than others who are newer and less skilled. You can't really put the onus on the agency. They're not employers. They're an agency, they're a contractor. They're not responsible for that. It's the interpreters who are running the business. That's their responsibility to learn, to understand the going rate, and to charge appropriately. That's their responsibility.
And I definitely agree with you that the interpreters need to decide. But at the same time, interpreters that are in the field do charge some high rates that are unreasonable. And it may be based on the area. Like, for example, in the Bay Area or in New York, there's a huge variation in the rates that are charged because costs of living are more expensive in those areas. But how do we not protect, that might be the wrong word, but monitor that rate, those charges, compared to the interpreters who don't consider themselves as independent contractors? Some do and some don't. And they may rely on the agency to decide the rate for them. The Bay Area or New York, for example, will just go ahead and charge a high rate. But, that does affect the deaf community. Are they able to get access to interpreting services? Are they able to get quality services? Because a lot of them are like buying, as you said, a product, right? And so they're going to go with what's cheaper. So the Bay Area or New York, the quality of services is varied depending on who's interpreting, but the community is struggling for access, and less deaf people are able to get employment or have job opportunities because they don't have the services available. So it's really important for us to think about, I don't want to say the ethics behind it, but really to have an open, transparent dialogue. How do we do that regarding rates? What should be done?
Well, my answer is a simple, I don't know. But one thing I do think about is that a part of that process is natural. There's a breaking point between services and rates, right? What I've noticed is that sometimes, for example, I've seen a number of interpreters who work around in the community and they earn a sort of average amount. And then the more expensive interpreters have less work. They just do this and that. They don't have as much work. And that's because they're beyond that breaking point.
That's a really good point. Okay.
Sometimes their skills are fabulous, but requests for them are very specialized. So sometimes their name offers the opportunity, like they have a reputation and people ask for them specifically, but they're over the breaking point. So the example you mentioned, Bay Area, New York, that kind of thing, the rates are amazingly high compared to the Central Valley of California, where it's lower, or Colorado or Montana, or just other places in the country where the cost of living is so much less. But every area has a sort of what we would call breaking point. So there's a little bit of a natural regulation built in. And the other part that you just talked about, how do we, not ethically, but monitor in some way this whole business? That's tough to answer because, again, our discussions about rates have not been open. We don't have those kinds of discussions. So we don't have a system that says, here are the tiers, this is the level. If you have certification, if you have certain criteria, you should earn this much, or that much. It's not been we are part of the open market, but it hasn't been part of our discussion. So we haven't had the ability to regulate that. I think if interpreters charge too much, I think in general, agencies won't pay. I don't think agencies will pay interpreters too close to that breaking point. So the agency will say, no, thank you, or they'll contract them with them, but they'll never give them work. I think that's a natural form of regulation and a natural part of regulation.
So I think that leads to talking about the agency interacting with an interpreter as an employee versus as an independent contractor. I'm curious your perspective and your opinion on that, because there are some agencies who treat their independent contractors like employees, and some interpreters who expect to be paid as contractors but treated as employees. So there's a lot of overlapping layers here between the IC and the employee perspective. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
And I would love to hear the answer on that as well.
Well, we're very lucky here in California. And when I say lucky, I'm being quite snide. In California, our opinion means nothing because they just passed a new law, AB 5. And that law, once it passed, at first it heavily influenced the interpreting community. At first, there were layoffs and things like that, but then it spread to other fields, many other fields. So now interpreters are excluded from that law in general. But we still have to be very careful how we control that relationship. And, you know, sometimes California establishes a law and it'll influence the whole United States, right? And now I'm seeing other states watching AB 5 because they've gotten a lot of benefit in the tax area. So AB 5 has the following meaning. They established 3 important questions. If you answer those questions but with a yes, any one of them, you're labeled an employee. So for example, one of those questions is, the agency that's contracting with you, are they in that line of business? Which means if they're an ASL interpreting agency and they hire you, you failed the test. That means you are more like an employee. In the California state government's view, they feel that a contract is only appropriate when you're looking for a worker who does work that you don't typically do. That's an important part. Now, interpreters are at this moment excluded from AB 5, but it doesn't change how we have to proceed. We have to be very careful with our relationship dynamics. You just mentioned that some agencies regulate the interpreters or treat them like employees. And many of them enjoy that, it would appear, because they expect to be paid on cycle and steady pay and all those kind of things, and to have benefits, as it were. But that's not how it works. For example, independent contractors do the work and then bill the agency. And whatever that is, whatever's in the contract. Some contracts have 60-day cycles for pay. Mm-hmm. That is a long time. And many interpreters can't survive with that kind of length of time between work and pay. So I've seen people say, I need a 2-week pay cycle. And agencies have been willing to pay in 2-week cycles. So they don't have to pay the money until 60 days. But I see that that's part of their relationship with the interpreters. Another example is an agency will offer jobs and they'll accept the jobs and work all over, do the jobs. And if something happens at the workplace, they call the agency and then the agency negotiates with the contractor. If something happens while you're an employee, then it's appropriate to have them talk to the boss, to talk to the agency. But an independent contractor doesn't represent me as an interpreter, so I can't rely on the interpreter to manage these things. I have to represent myself. I can't depend on the interpreter. If I'm an employee, I can rely on the agency because I work under the agency. So maybe the agency says things I don't agree with. Maybe their perspective or point of view. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Like, what happens if you disagree with the agency? What do you do? What does that mean? You're not an employee. They're not an employer. You're not under them. You represent yourself. The agency does not represent you if you're an independent contractor. But there are a lot of places where the agency treats people as employees. I saw a contract recently that said, you must bill us on the first of the month. Of every month, you must invoice. The agency can't control that. They can't force the interpreter to do that. So I've seen a number of things like this that are highly inappropriate.
So should the interpreters confront the agency with those errors and say, oh, you're telling me I have to invoice a specific time of the month or so many times per month, or, if they're trying to instruct or order the IC to do something that is a violation of employment law, what do the interpreters do? How do they handle that? And how can they address that with the agency without it being coming across as a threat and maintaining a good working rapport?
That is so interesting. For example, agencies set these things up like we pay on bill on the 1st and the 15th of the month, please. And if they change their approach and say we process on the 1st and the 15th, that's just fine. But nothing like you must send me the invoice by those dates. That wouldn't work. But the other way works. So let me give you an example that happened to me a little while ago. I was working with an agency after this story. I was doing something and they contacted me and they said, your name was brought up and we want you to come and interpret for this event. And I said, sure, I'd be very happy to do that. And they asked me for my certification and all that. And I sent all that over there and they read through it. And then they asked me for my rate, which is appropriate. And I sent my rate. They responded with, no, it depends on your portfolio, your profile. We'll pay you this amount based on your portfolio or profile. And that amount was below the going rate. I know the going rate in that area. And they were going to pay me less. And so I said, no, thank you. I'm not willing to do that, but thank you very much. And they contacted me again and said, what's up? That's fair. That's a fair price. You should provide the service. The consumer requested you, and they tried to guilt me to do that work for them, to earn less than my colleagues. For me, it was just weird. If you contacted me, I didn't contact you. You contacted me, and now I have to fight with you about my rate. And I have to tell you, my rate was very ordinary, not at all overpriced. I'm actually kind of cheap. So I was really shocked. So I cut my relationship off with that relationship. And that has been going on for a long time that I don't work with them. I've seen a number of agencies doing that kind of behavior with their interpreters. And I saw one of my colleagues got an email from an agency. We would be willing to pay you this depending on your qualifications. And I looked at that and I said, you can't do that. So the regulating part, that's where it becomes sticky. For me, I understand the perspective of how do we negotiate without ruining the relationship or having a downright fight, but I think it's very difficult. It depends on what our goals are. It's their goals are to recruit more interpreters, right? They need to provide the services and they need to earn a profit from that, and they have to maintain a business. But I think the important piece is that the interpreters, the agencies, the business piece and all that, putting all that aside, let's talk about the deaf consumer. We rarely talk about the most disempowered people in this picture. They have no power. We have to focus on them. I think the agency and my goals are if the agency and my goals are aligned, regarding that, we can move forward without damaging or threatening one another.
And I think, like you mentioned, sometimes the agencies are just focused on not really the quality, but just filling those needs, right? And getting that profit and not focusing on the needs of the client. Like, for example, if it's a life or death situation and they say, oh, sorry, we're not going to pay your rate because you're too expensive. But that consumer, maybe it's a new consumer or someone who's used their services for a long time, but they need that access. And sometimes the agency has to just go ahead and quote unquote, eat the cost, right? To maintain the relationship with that consumer, to keep the contract with whatever entity or party they've contracted with. And I believe sometimes we have to look at the quality versus the profit. That should be the bottom line.
We can do that. You can do that. As Bucky can do that. But if you were the deaf consumers, but the consumers can't do that. The hospitals can't do that. Other organizations can't do that. They can't go in and assess the quality of the interpreter. From their viewpoint, what they see is a bill. And the agency charges the same amount for all interpreters. I'm going to make up a number, but let's say $100 an hour for any interpreter. So they send those bills all the time. And one of those interpreters is magnificent. Two are pretty new. One's developing. All of them get the same amount, are charged the same amount of money by the hospital, to the hospital. So they can't screen that. That goes back to the agency. The hospital can't determine.
Right. One approach that we use at my agency that we tried several years ago was a marketplace concept. So, we had the interpreters that were giving us our rates, and we would go and say, that's $40. And from that, as the agency, we would add on our overhead. I don't remember exactly what that cost was. We'll say it was 10% markup that we did for our overhead.
Yeah, maybe 45.
So then we would end up billing them, $44 at that point. And we felt like that was an appropriate approach for the deaf consumers, that we were minimizing what we were losing for our variations in services. But over time, as we continued to grow, we saw issues coming up with that. And especially because our platform is so geared towards the deaf consumers. For example, we had a situation one time where we had a deaf consumer who preferred one specific interpreter, and they were a very seasoned interpreter and had a fairly high rate, like $60, right? So they would bill, and it was just pretty regular. And all of a sudden, that interpreter wasn't available for their next meeting that deaf consumer requested them for. So the deaf consumer selected a different interpreter, and the interpreter they selected this time was a $40 interpreter. And so when their boss saw that bill and said, whoa, why is it so much cheaper than it was before? And the deaf person says, oh, well, my preferred interpreter wasn't available, so we went with somebody else. And then the boss says, no, I'm going to pick the interpreter at this point. I'm going to find the cheapest interpreter that will do that job for you. And I saw that as an agency and think, and we just try and educate them as much as we can, but their money, their eyes are on that bottom line. So we completely had to move away from that concept after that point.
Yeah, they don't understand.
That's the same. That's a systemic problem, right? There hasn't been enough research. There isn't enough data out there, not enough evidence. So people don't understand what interpreting really is. You ask people, hey, do you think interpreting is an automatic process? What they sign automatically matches what's said? And people say, oh yeah, 100% match. They don't realize that the best interpreters are just really skilled at approximation in terms of what the person's signing. They don't realize that it's not an automatic process. The boss is looking at that $40 versus $60, and for the boss, they're the same product. He sees no difference between those two actually services.
That's so true. And, with CDIs, it's the same approach. It can be so difficult sometimes when you have a hearing population that doesn't value the CDI's work and what they bring to the hearing interpreters and the deaf consumers and the company or agency in general. The CDIs, that sometimes can be the same way, because many agencies, honestly, they see the CDI, and CDI sometimes have a tough time getting jobs because it's the approach of the agency, or the company may look at it and say, well, this is cheaper. And we would just rather have one hearing interpreter than a team with a CDI, which is additional money. So I'm curious about your perspective with the CDIs. How do we bring them into this conversation?
That's a very big and important point right now to be talked about, CDIs. One of the things that I've tended to notice is that the language in terms of contract terms for hearing interpreters is very strong. The language terms for CDI or the use of a deaf interpreter is very weak.
I definitely agree.
For example, when you see hearing interpreters contracts, it says terms, it says 2-hour minimum, must have two interpreters if it's over an hour. Some contexts require 2 interpreters regardless. All these conditions that are not negotiable, they're very clearly outlined. So that means when an agency signs on with business or something, it's already within their agreement. There's no real discussion of that. When we talk about CDI, the language regarding CDI or the terms, it's best if, it's better if, you ought to, you should, we recommend. It's such weak language, and that language does not support the strength needed to put CDIs in a working environment, in a working area. For example, Bucky mentioned that the boss looked at $40 and $60 and said, oh, let's go with the $40 employee. Let's not the $40 interpreter, not the $60 one. Well, same idea. If you say things like we recommend, from the business perspective, they say you're recommending, but the benefit looks like it's going to you. It's a conflict of interest. The only benefit is to the agency. The language should be stronger, as it is with hearing interpreters, the team required, and all that kind of thing. It really depends on the agency, but if, for example, there's a media job, they require a CDI and that's all there is to it, or whatever, there are certain times when they require a CDI, and it shouldn't be negotiable. It shouldn't be discussed. It's possible that the company or the business will move to another agency, of course, but then you have to think about their actions as an agency. We, as a field, need to hold them accountable. If they're sending interpreters in situations where you must have a DI, I've had that experience myself where I've gone to a job and the situation really required a deaf interpreter. It required that. And I reached out to the agency, and it happened that 2 or 3 weeks later, they sent a different hearing interpreter. That's all. They never sent the deaf interpreter. The person who lost out was me, I guess, because they didn't call me back, because they knew if I went back and there was no deaf interpreter, I would say, hello, we need a deaf interpreter. So for me, the agency, I'm clear. The agency isn't doing what's in the best interest of the deaf consumer. So I'm forewarned about that.
Well, that begs the question, are we holding agencies accountable when interpreters or deaf consumers recognize these patterns in agency behavior, whether it's sending a hearing interpreter without a CDI or sending a cheaper or lower qualified interpreter to situations that do require a CDI? And when agencies continue to make those decisions that are frankly unethical practices, how do we, as a community of deaf consumers and interpreters, how do we hold the agencies accountable?
Well, at the moment, it's almost impossible because there aren't enough agencies, there aren't enough interpreters. So if you have one agency in an area where, for example, it's a rural area and they only have one little agency and they run everything and they're unethical, inappropriate, business practices are inappropriate. And if they fall apart, if they fail, then there will be no access whatsoever. There will be no service. So the end results are not looking great. We put up with their horrific action, or there's nothing, no access at all, which is really tough. You look at the bigger agencies that serve in a nationwide way. I think it's already happening. I'm not mentioning any names, but there are some big agencies. Maybe they're not specifically ASL interpreting agencies, maybe spoken language too, whatever. But those agencies, there are a lot of interpreters who don't contract with them based on their business practices. But I think that refusal to be involved with them occurs because of how it affects us directly as interpreters, compared to how their behavior affects deaf consumers. And really, we have two different forms of impact here. The use of a CDI is very important. We have to have them. Yes, they struggle for work because most businesses aren't going to pay for 2 interpreters when they think they can have 1. Why should they hire 2, is their thought. But then also deaf consumers. So many deaf people have said they prefer having a CDI regardless of the situation. They just prefer to watch the CDIs interpreting so that they don't have to internally interpret everything they're looking at. And so both of those affect what we're doing. If I'm moving forward as an interpreter, it's easy for me as a hearing interpreter to say, nah, I don't need a CDI, and to just take the work as it comes along and just put aside the idea of a CDI. But we have to think of how much damage that creates over time. And that's just one person. The agency has so much more influence, so much more control. If the agency were willing to send interpreters CDIs, especially where, if they send hearing interpreters where CDIs should be sent, they're setting a standard for businesses all around. They're saying, oh, it's fine. And then when they're ready to send a CDI, people say, no, because all this time, looking at their history, they've never sent a CDI before. Why is it now you want me to have a CDI? You're trying to get extra money. So the answer from businesses tends to be no, and they close the door on CDIs on deaf interpreters all the time.
Yeah, I believe that the interpreting field is self-monitored, right? And that's the most difficult thing, is because as independent contractors, you are independent, which so it is what it is. So the accountability check needs to be happening. And that's where the community and the interpreters as a whole need to talk about the rates. They need to talk about all of that, but also to keep each other accountable, to really reflect the results and having better services. And it all comes back to the interpreters, because the interpreters are monitoring the field and the agencies are supporting those freelancers. So everything is coexisting. And I really believe that there has to be monitoring for this to still be able to be successful. Okay, so I feel like we've talked so much about this and we could continue to talk more. I want to go ahead and open up for the audience discussion. But before I do, for any Q&A, do you have any last minute remarks, Jonathan?
I'm waiting for the interpreter. Great. I think we've discussed a great deal in a very short amount of time. I'm overwhelmed. Oh my God. But maybe why don't we move it over to Q&A, and maybe there's this is just the right time for that.
Okay, so Bucky, do you want to go ahead and take care of that and open it up to Q&A?
Sure. I want to see if anybody would like to raise their hand and come on screen to ask a question directly before we look at any of the written questions. I'll pull those up and look at them, but if we have any raised hands, we could do that first. Okay, so I see some questions in Q&A that have been asked in the chat. Would anybody like to come up and ask those? If not, we can sign those on screen. Okay, so there's one question on here by Ernest Williams or Willems. It says, how can we encourage hearing interpreters to add a CDI, which is a must and required for specific jobs? How can we encourage them to add that into their own terms and conditions of their contract as considerations to always be sent with a CDI? That would definitely help improve opportunities for CDI's employment. I definitely
love that question. I absolutely love that question.
My typical answer is, I don't know. But really, you have to think about the perspective in our field that there's tremendous competition, right? Hearing interpreters compete with other hearing interpreters for the jobs, for the positions, and then to add a CDI, they might feel more challenges in that competition. They don't know quite what to do. To this day, a hearing interpreter might think, if I have to have a CDI, it means I'm not good enough. So once we change that perspective from me to them, me to the consumer, instead of looking at myself, looking outward and thinking about what the consumer needs. And again, the deaf interpreter CDIs, they're deaf. They're from a minority group and they know how to support the clients. And so it's double damage. If we don't support the use of CDIs, we hurt them and the deaf consumer. And I think in general, first of all, we need more exposure as a field. We simply need more exposure. When I talk with hearing interpreters, maybe, for example, with 5 years or less experience, they have zero experience working with CDIs, none at all. And those who are working 0 to 5 years should certainly be working with CDIs much more often than others even, but they have no experience. So we have an exposure problem. That's number one. And secondly, we don't have enough CDI exposure training embedded, whatever, all that embedded into their training. So what's in the curriculum in ITPs or in general, what I tend to see is hearing and deaf teams. That's it. That's the training, hearing and deaf teams. But we need much more training than just the very superficial level of exposure for working with deaf interpreters. For example, many hearing interpreters are petrified of working with a deaf interpreter, for real.
Yeah.
They are petrified. They're afraid that if they make a mistake, something horrible will happen. They have no real understanding of why the CDI is there. And they don't realize that really the deaf interpreter is not sort of trying to act like they're better than the hearing interpreter. They're here as your team. They can negotiate back and forth. They can work as a team. They don't put in an interpreter like a punishment to monitor the bad hearing interpreter. We need more exposure. We need more training. And genuinely, what's behind that is perhaps that we don't do enough as interpreters to bring in more CDI, more deaf interpreters. Bucky, go ahead.
Yeah, and one idea that my business partner has mentioned was having CDIs be part of our requirements. For example, if we have something like a house in California, internship requirements. So, example, if we've got somewhere in California, we've got the earthquakes, we've got the faults going in California all the time, right? So if there's for a house to have earthquake insurance, they have to meet certain parameters, right? We have to have a specific type of foundation. Everything has to be set up correctly. And if it has those things, then you can get it insured, right? But if that house hasn't met those certain requirements, then companies won't provide them insurance. So if we take that same picture and we apply that to working with deaf interpreters, if we said, minors, less than 18-year-olds. If we went ahead and had an interpreter in that situation, a hearing interpreter without a CDI interpreter, that there wouldn't be insurance there, that work wouldn't be covered. Now, that was something that my business partner mentioned, and we actually contacted our insurance agent, and he is deaf himself, and he said, that's an interesting idea. So I'm wondering if that will go anywhere and that we could create that type of requirement and type of actual legal insurance accountability for interpreters, that in those situations, we're not going to cover the work if it's not done appropriately with a CDI.
I think in theory, that is so cool. Such a cool idea. But the problem is we don't have enough CDIs right now.
But we have to create the opportunity for them to come in.
Oh, I totally get that. But it means your plan will have to be on hold for 15 to 20 years. Can you imagine if interpreters all over the U.S. couldn't have insurance for their work until there were CDIs in place? I'm just messing with you, but because I really agree, we simply need more CDIs, more deaf interpreters, and we need to give them opportunities. But at the same time, we don't even have enough hearing interpreters, and we have an even greater lack of deaf interpreters. So come on, Bucky. You have all the answers. Come on.
Oh, well, let me look at another question. Yes.
Yeah, I was looking at one of the questions here. Diana mentioned Jonathan. She was responding to you personally. It is a huge problem, and some agencies in Colorado are infamous for giving brand new interpreters fresh out of the program assignment that you'd expect an inexperienced interpreter to receive. And many don't know their rights, and they just don't understand the interpreter skills. And those newly graduated are now, in those positions. And it's unfortunate for many deaf and hard of hearing who don't know their rights. That is an ethical violation, but also it can become a legal violation. And so the question would be, who is responsible to make sure that the title is protected and that those violations don't happen? Is it the person, the interpreter accepting the job? Is it the agency? Is it the company? Or is it a mixture of both?
I would say both, but I would say more of the responsibility is on the agency. Again, we have to look at the quote bottom line. If they're hiring, if an agency contracts with a new interpreter, recent graduate, for example, they don't know how much, I don't know how much they know in college. I don't think in college when they're learning how to interpret that they learn what to charge. So the agency takes advantage of that so that they can have a bigger profit margin. So people who know the going rate, people who know the average charge of services in the area, the agency would know those things. The interpreter might charge less, and then the agency takes advantage of that. My viewpoint is the agency has responsibility around this. The other thing also is that in defense of new interpreters, they have no support from this community, none whatsoever. They graduate and then they fall off some cliff, and that's it. That's what I see. So many interpreters trying so hard and struggling for 5, 10, 15 years, trying to get better, trying to move upward, but they don't get there and they don't have a community that allows them to graduate into a community. I've been fascinating with the accounting in terms of their system. Their students, their graduates, have so many resources that they hook them up with and all that kind of thing. It's amazing. We don't have that. Other graduates do have that. When our interpreters graduate, they are out in the wild. So many university students, when they're finished with school, they have all these resources, not ITP students. So then when they take the jobs, more experienced interpreters reject them and yell at them, but they can't grow because they don't have exposure. Our ability to grow and develop can't be simulated in a mock situation. So their learning in school has to be moved out into the real world, having real life in situ experience. And so the more experienced interpreters aren't creating opportunities for them as well as for CDIs. So they're stagnant for a long time. And they might practice themselves, they watch videos and do what they can, but it's not always something that translates into real world experience. For me, the agency has more responsibility. I feel very strongly that the agency needs to have a deep and powerful network for new interpreters and should be connecting to the universities that are turning out these interpreters. And the agency should have the responsibility to make sure that they're properly supported once they're working for them.
Thank you so much. And I want to say that was a fabulous question as well. Bucky?
Yeah, I see Rainey has a question and actually wanted to come on screen to ask their question. So can we get them up?
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, so my question is related to this, but I was kind of thinking about RID as well, RID chapters and how those are involved and the role that those play. And so there's a few interpreters that have discussed, why doesn't our state RID chapter act almost like a union, which means that they would have committees who dialogue and then discuss rates in the region. And if anyone disagrees with those rates, then they could go to the RID specifically to a meeting and discuss the rates and why they feel it should be fluctuating. And then the agencies would be able to follow those RID chapters because the interpreters have already discussed the rates. There's been some type of an agreement within the union for an established rate. And each region in our state would have representatives who come together every so often to agree upon these rates. Because in the beginning, you talked about a buyer who doesn't know what they're buying, quote unquote, right? And so it's a similar idea with a plumber or a mechanic. I just send them my card. I send them to my car to the shop, and I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that they fix my car accordingly. And if they come to my home, I'm betting on the word of mouth or by other friends who've told me that this person is qualified to do the plumbing in my house. So if there's some type of standard that is, supposed to be followed, following ethics, then we all will get the same education and we all have to pass the same test, right? For this. The question is for all three of you, really, with regards to a state chapter as an established authority where all would be following what's been decided upon instead of these random rates that are established willy-nilly, so to speak. And so now I'm wondering, if there's kind of like a quote unquote anarchy in our field right now. Everyone is just deciding whatever they want to charge. But if there's an RID chapter, like right now, there's not really one that's been set where they discuss these types of things. And what's the purpose of them? It's kind of aimless right now in a way, the RIT chapters that we have right now, because they're not discussing these type of things. But if there were to be that in place, not quote unquote a union, but some type of way that we could then monitor these rates from the interpreters and that everybody would agree upon a specific rate for a region. What do you guys think about that?
Thank you.
Jonathan, do you want to take that first?
Oh, me?
And my camera's still on, so I guess you're talking to me. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. You're first.
Okay.
Give me your answer.
I will give you my answer and say that I disagree with that option. I will say that.
Okay, bring it on.
RID chapters consist of, those people in the area. But what if at some point there's a team of unexperienced interpreters who approach that committee or that team that aren't at that level? So that's one reason I feel like that's not going to be an appropriate or effective solution.
I think that's one reason that I also disagree. I think RID's chapters have their role, and I think many of them don't do a good job with that role. And now to include more responsibility regarding managing pricing and all that, that would be very difficult. And the most important part is you need to have buy-in. You have to have buy-in. For younger interpreters, at least less experienced interpreters, the incentive for them to join is to become more up to par with the other interpreters. But people with all this experience and seniority, they might not have that same motivation. Another reason I'm concerned about that idea and thinking it might not work is, how do you separate? Okay, you're an interpreter who's now on the board of your local chapter. Whoa, I don't want to be you, because you're making decisions that affect people's lives. You're having conversations and people are aware of those conversations. It's a pretty sticky spot to be involved in that level in that situation. But in general, it's impossible to regulate pricing, rates, and so forth without a set actual union. Like the mechanics and so forth, they have a union. They have a suggested price list, and many don't follow it. I'll tell you, recently, my brother was in an auto accident.
Oh, I'm so
sorry. They towed the truck, and he was, but he's okay, thank you. But the car was totaled. So they towed the car, and I told them, we're not sure if we'll handle it with insurance or not. You'd think that the tow would cost, what, $100? They were only going 2 miles, $200. They charged almost $1,000.
What?
Who was managing that? Who was organizing that? There was no possible way to stop them from charging that ridiculous amount of money. It was absolutely crazy. And I think the reason they charge so much is because they typically charge the insurance companies as much as possible, and the insurance companies control the rates. So they bill them $1,000, and the insurance company says, no, we'll only pay you $500. But if we manage it outside of insurance, they go way high. So it's very tough. It's very, very tough. There are so many factors. It's a very interesting idea. Very interesting.
And I'm curious your thoughts. Well, of course, the community is thinking about my access and my needs should be met. And that's one perspective. But at the same time, we're also bringing in less qualified interpreters in this field, right? Naturally, people want to make a living. They need to survive. And so with those rate restrictions, people will say that's not going to be, and also, competition is healthy in general. So interpreters are going to feel like, well, my rate needs to match my skills. And the deaf community will get less qualified interpreters and less services and less access if those interpreters decide not to be in the field because the rate is so low. Of course, in theory, it looks good, but I think that it would really cause chaos in the field of interpreting. And that's my 2 cents, just from a deaf community perspective, as a member of the deaf community. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering my question. I want to thank you for raising the question. That was a great question.
Thank you.
So it's already 9:00 EST. So I'll give Jonathan the last comment if you want to wrap up.
The last thing to say is thank you, everyone, for coming. And please really know this discussion was just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to discuss. We've only scratched the surface, but it has been my pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed being at Buzz Corner today, and thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming
Excellent.
today and being a part of this conversation and this discussion. And we hope everyone has a wonderful night. Bye-bye for now.
Excellent.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night, all.
Good night.